Welcome to Art and AI, Collective Intelligence, Collective Governance, and to an evening during which we explore the question how art productions prototype new ways of collaborating with AI. My name is Mercedes Bunce, Professor in Digital Culture and Society at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and I will be chairing this evening. Besides this, I also have the important role of explaining to you what to do in case of a fire alarm, if I remember correctly from last event. Correct me if I'm wrong, behind me. Don't go out where you came in case of a fire alarm. It's a real alarm, and you go out this way behind me. And the toilets are on the other side, so not here, but there. Let's move to our topic after we managed our bodily functions and know where to put our bodies. Current concerns about AI and creativity often revolve around training data, which is scraped and extracted from the internet to train AI models. This may empower developers, but often overrides the interests of the data subjects and data creators. At the same time, the following is the case. AI organizations open about their data training are facing lawsuits. Those that keep their data sets not disclosed, they are not very often facing lawsuits. So this is quite a messed up situation. It incentivizes organizations to be non-transparent and is why data contributors currently remain an unacknowledged and disempowered group in the AI model building pipeline. New mechanisms need to be found that allow for creative work to be used in training data sets with the creative's knowledge, consent, and maybe even compensation. Who wouldn't dream of that? However, at the same time, we also don't want to live in a world in which only big tech corporations can pay for data sets and therefore are the only organizations or people able to train. So we need to find a way to share our data in a managed way that allows it to be shared with research and public interest projects. How do we find a way out of this mess? Tonight we want to look at the one potential mechanism that could help here, a data trust experiment. It came out of Serpentine's excellent and timely work with and around the exhibition The Call by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, which has just opened. How many of you have been there already? Oh, that's nearly half of the room. The others have time until 2nd February to go. The main focus of this evening will be on the ongoing data trust experiment that is one of the backbones of this exhibition, which Serpentine Arts Technologies has prototyped since spring 2024, or actually longer. We will explore the reason for the artist and the curator to build the exhibition and the model used in it around that data trust experiment. We will learn about the role that art and art institutions can play in providing a different perspective on AI, one that is often missing in a cacophony of industry experts and tech solutionists who forget that the calculation of meaning that is now possible is a matter in which all of us are involved. Matt Dryhurst and arts tech curator Eva Jäger will kick us off introducing how they approached AI for this exhibition and why a data trust experiment was part of it. Then this is followed by a talk of the data intermediary Jennifer Ding, who is a senior researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, and Victoria Ivanova, who led the in-depth legal and design analysis as the Serpentine strategic research lead for the arts and tech department. Both will explain how, together with 15 UK choirs and a choral AI dataset that was created, which was supported by further foundational work of Serpentine's art tech curatorial team, Eva Jäger, Ruth Waters, and Vi Trin. Some of them are on their well-deserved holiday. It was quite a lot of work to do this, and it is really outstanding work. Practical data trust experiments are still rare due to their novelty and maybe even more complexity. Having followed the making of the project from afar as the observing researcher, I can confirm that the organizations and attention to detail of this experiment was immense, overwhelming, hard work, so kudos to the whole team. The more I'm excited to have in the end then after we talked about the art, we talked about the data trust experiment, Aidan Pepin, who will join us in a second. He's very busy still taking a call in the green room in the back. And he will comment and reflect on the work. Aidan is Policy and Responsible AI Lead at Cohere's AI Research Lab. And before that, he was at the Ada Lovelace Institute, leading their public participation and research team and projects. So we are looking forward to hear about the project, starting with the exhibition. Eva, please join Matt on stage.
Thanks so much, Mercedes, also for organizing this event. So yeah, I'm Eva. I worked on, from the curatorial side and production and design of the project, thinking a lot about how we could make this project much more than just an exhibition, but really an opportunity to test in the wild some of the propositions that our team and Matt and Holly have, which are very much aligned. And we couldn't have asked for better partners in Matt and Holly because, of course, their practice is so steeped in these kinds of experiments. So if we could get Matt up on the screen, possibly, he can wave from his living room in Berlin. Hi, Matt.
Hi, everyone.
So we're going to kind of tag team. Matt's going to start just giving a little bit of background about his and his wife and creative partner Holly Herndon's practice, and then we'll kind of talk you through the different steps of the exhibition, and also show you some imagery of the exhibition itself, since as we saw, some people haven't seen it yet. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is as in remote coordination. Sorry, I can't be there in person, but I can see the slides, which is good. Okay, so hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Eva. Thank you, Mercedes. This is a cool opportunity. We're going to give a tiny bit of a backstory. For those who aren't familiar, Holly and I have been working across art and music for quite some time. We released a bunch of records in the past, and we saw records as kind of to facilitate wider experiments. The one on the right there, Proto, we started in 2017, and was kind of the original point where we started playing around with training data for AI models. The initial observation being that, you know, the first question you have to answer when you're training an AI model is what data to use. And so already back then it became really clear, like, oh, well, you know, this is going to be a really big deal. It asks some serious questions about, you know, current and also invites us to ask the question of, you know, what do we do now that we are all aware, or all increasingly aware of the fact that training AI models is just what we do now? You know, can we make training AI performative consenting something we do deliberately rather than incidentally, which is kind of how, as Mercedes kind of introduced it, is kind of how things seem to happen at the moment. Yeah, so Proto is worth checking out in some of the work we did around that record. But a few years later, I think this is in 2021, we had a project called Holly Plus, which was an experiment in what we describe as identity play, which is, of course, a pun on IP. This basic idea of saying, okay, in the future that we're going toward, maybe it makes sense in a consenting way to play with your identity and actually offer your identity as a skin or as a model for other people to assume and play around with. So Holly, if you go to holly.plus, the model will now sound hideously dated, but you could upload any audio, and what would return back to you is that piece of music sung in Holly's voice. What may be more interesting around that project is the kind of protocol, which is a word we use a lot. We built around it, and the protocol basically said that, you know, Holly's voice and identity was free for anybody to use, for anybody to wear. And the only condition really is that when profit is made, so if somebody, for example, made a song that they wanted to release commercially, they would cut us in. slightly, right? And so that model, I think is more familiar now, was a little more kind of abstract at the time, but really narrows in on kind of our principle of like, trying to be permissive with this, of saying, okay, we're entering into a new age of IP. How do we experiment with this without kind of falling back on maybe kind of antiquated notions of ownership and so on? And that qualifies, I guess, what everyone will be talking about today.
Shall I play the demo?
Yeah, okay, this is maybe fun. So, a year after we went to TED and, and talked about this idea of identity play and kind of sharing your permissive with your identity with others. And so this demo is a demo of Fur, a great singer from Seattle, actually using the Holly Plus model to sing performance Holly in real time.
I don't know what to say when you come around acting this way. And yes, the truth is I show you every day,
'cause you love to stay living in all the pain,
and it gets so murky, loving what you know, but I'll keep on swimming further up the road.
Fun, I guess it's over. Yeah, okay, great. So so again, this idea of saying, what would it mean to share your data with other people, to ostensibly kind of take a leap of faith and be deliberate about how we deal with this data, as opposed to just take perhaps a more cynical or protective approach. And this is repeating kind of what I said earlier. We actually have a publication coming out in partnership with Serpentine that Aoife edited and wrote a great piece for, called "All Media is Training Data," that goes into some of these ideas again, just to reiterate, the idea being, what, now that we are aware that we are training these machines, what are the new habits? What is the new kind of protocol, or what are the new manners that we establish to be able to govern and also just explore the possibilities here? It's probably worth also mentioning, parallel with that TED thing in 2022, we co-founded an organization called Spawning. Spawning is a neologism that Holly and I came up with to basically differentiate what's happening with AI-generated media from the tradition of sampling. So spawning is more kind of reproductive, right? It's like spawning is producing new emergent media based on a training corpus of earlier media, which is very, very different to sampling intuitively, I think. And so Spawning is an organization, we've done a bunch of policy work. Most notably, we built and probably the most, if not the only, opt-out system for AI data. It's currently used by Hugging Face, Stability, so on and so forth. There's 2 billion images that people have decided to opt out of future data sets. And more recently, we've been working a lot on a lot of public domain data. So, we're actually next week releasing a really, really large text image pair public domain data set that we're calling PD12M. And pretty soon releasing a model we call public diffusion, which is a performant, ready to be fine-tuned image model that is only trained on public domain data, which we think is kind of a really interesting imposition to the copyright wars, right? It's like currently you can't copyright a model or copyright outputs of a model or something like this. Well, if the base training data is all public domain and you fine-tune it with your art or your thought, why can't you own that model and offer it in various ways to other people? So Spawning is kind of involved in this space and does a lot of work, and there's a team of people who should all be credited for working on that. So to get to the core, as Aoife mentioned briefly, the idea here was to say, okay, we have our own ideas about how our IP, about how our art might be used in this context, but the broader kind of challenge is how do you scale this to other people? Like, how do you create experiments where can one be confronted with these questions often for the first time? And we felt that choral music, I mean, it's kind of easy for us in the sense because of Holly's like obsession with choral music, is kind of a beautiful metaphor to explore this, right? Like choirs already produce emergent effects. Choirs are already kind of governed by consensus. They already kind of have their own internal democratic methods. What if we went on a tour of the UK and invited a bunch of choirs to all contribute to a data set that they would ultimately own? In order to facilitate this, we put together a songbook that, to go back to this theme of like deliberate training data, this is a songbook where basically if you sing all of the songs in the book, you will have covered the full harmonic and phonetic range of the English language, sufficient that a model could be trained on your voice. Right. So any of you that have done the exercise of kind of, 11 labs or something, you go there and you try and train a model on your voice. You have to do this very kind of boring mantra where you read a bunch of garbage words in order for it to be able to understand your voice. And we're like, well, actually, this is a performance. It would be very fun to formalize this into a songbook that we then shared with all of these choirs. And maybe one interesting other aspect is that the songbook is, I mean, it's partly inspired by the Sacred Harp shape note tradition, which is great. But the songbook also has a bunch of prompts for abstraction or for play, right, in the kind of Orff Schulwerk kind of pedagogic tradition of inviting people to explore the music inside themselves, as opposed to like sit there like lab rats deliberately reading exactly what you said. So the book is open to interpretation, which of course produces a lot more rich data. The data set is actually quite varied, as opposed to being standardized, which just turns out is great for model training. You need a variety of data to produce the optimal model. The thing that Ava might play now, actually, an example of, here we go, a choir singing all of this music. Beautiful. Okay, and so it's really worth establishing that the data set itself is not just a stereo pair. What's useful about this, should the choirs come to a conclusion, is actually we believe it would be the richest data set for AI research available, particularly for group singing. And what we did, and you can kind of see here, is establish kind of like a training rig and protocol there, where you have an outer ring, often of people who maybe don't feel super comfortable reading from a songbook, so they can drone and just kind of contribute freely, and an inner ring of singers who are labbed up, so you get like a very close recording of them. And actually, if you go to the exhibition, there's a very beautiful multi-channel kind of rendition of each of these recordings, where you get to hear, kind of zoom in and hear each individual voice should you want. Then you can kind of zoom out and hear ambisonic documentation of the rooms in question. One of the interesting things there, maybe a bit nerdy, is we actually felt that this kind of future-proofed the data set too, to say that, currently when you're looking to train a model on voice or something, you're looking for, kind of crude stereo files. But going forward, it's actually, it actually behooves us to think about, how to produce richer, more information for future models, and the ambisonic mic does a beautiful job there. That's great footage too. It's actually the first time I've seen that. And so here's an example of the tour here. We tried our best to cover as much of the United Kingdom as possible. From the south to the north, from Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. It was a combination of kind of pro, semi-pro, and very, very amateur choirs who all have participated in the experiment, and as Eva will will go on to explain, all now form the body of this kind of collective that will be offered and has been offered tools to consensually determine the future of their data. With and just to maybe close off my point, as much as we and Serpentine FAE have incepted this, we've been trying to also practice what we preach, right? Like, we are also negotiating with the group at every stage to determine their level of comfort with how we use the voices in the show and for shows going forward. So I think that's the end of my little section, but I'm happy to be here and look forward to listening to the rest of it.
Thanks so much, Matt. Yeah, and then for the exhibition itself, this was just one node in the big project, and it was really important to us that we think of it as something kind of distinct, that we don't try to load the exhibition with lots of explanation about all of these different processes, that each of those have their own audience. And actually with the exhibition itself, we try and create something that's much more experiential. We worked with the design team in Berlin called Sub, and they were really amazing collaborators for us to think about a series of objects that would represent different training phases throughout the process. So the data collection phase, the computation and compression phase, and the field recording and gathering all of the data phase, and then the final output phase. So here, when you first walk into the exhibition, you're kind of confronted with or presented with an object that's called the hearth. And it's a new kind of instrument that plays sound through GPU fans. And the initial call that you hear on this loop, this audio installation loop that exists in the gallery, is actually the notes of the hymns that the choirs sing from. So it's that initial call and welcome to the choirs to come and sing with us, which was actually part of the real process. In the next space, visitors can experience field recordings of the sound. So we played Endless for you, but just in stereo. And if you come to the gallery space, you can actually hear it in surround sound. It's a really special experience. We tried to imbue a lot of these parts of the protocol that we just showed you into the sculpture itself, and also represents the kind of training process through these imagery panels that you see with kind of photos along the way and representation. Finally, in the oratory, we created a space where people could actually interact with the model. Matt and Holly often talk about the kind of collapse of consumption and production, and we felt it was really important that we give visitors a chance to actually interact with the models themselves. So I'll play you a sound, what that was like. And finally, in the perimeter of the space, people can actually hear the outputs of further models that were created using the data set. So I'll just end our section by playing a version of Endless, so using that kind of part of the embedding space in the model to create something completely novel created by the model itself, a new version of Endless.
an applause for Matt and Eva. Thank you all. So next, we're going to look at the data trust experiment, which I'm personally, as a real nerd, very excited about. So let's welcome Victoria Ivanova and Jennifer Ding.
So hi, everyone. So this is the nerdy part of the program. But we'll try to start from an exciting note. Well, first of all, I'm Victoria. I work very closely with Eva and the entire Arts Technologies team, leading on the research and development side of our department's activity. And with me is Jen, with whom we've been working very closely over the last, I guess, almost half a year now. And Jen, initially when we started working with, Jen was tasked with potentially being one of the first data trustees / intermediaries / stewards at an arts institution. And so part of the process that we'd undergone in the last half a year is to understand what that role could be, but also what types of infrastructures could be developed in a context of the type of art production that Eva has just described. So perhaps a little bit of a backstory as to why we were interested also in an infrastructural experiment in addition to just producing this incredible artwork and exhibition project and contributing to the development and evolution of Holly's and Matt's practice. So as part of our department's work, we like to look at culture as a laboratory for really unique experiments where we can not only put speculative ideas into how technology and society intersect, but we can actually prototype real infrastructures and new organizational forms. And so to this end, for a number of years, we've been publishing annual reports called Future Art Ecosystems Reports. And the last one that we have here focused on art and public AI, and that's a project Eva and I led. And what we were trying to propose in this publication was that actually culture has a lot of potential to shape the development of AI today, because ultimately when we think about the data layer of AI development, that is literally what culture does, and it was neatly grasped by Matt's quote, all media is now training data. It sort of points to the incredible affordances that we have in the cultural field to shape the direction of AI development from the perspective of data. So we propose in this publication that, contrary to a very binary approach to understanding AI from sort of closed and open or private and public, it makes more sense to think about a process of negotiating AI's publicness. And so we propose an approach where cultural institutions can step into a more empowered role to create sort of more thick versions of societal claims on AI as a public infrastructure. And the collective data governance experiment that Jen has led on in terms of actually designing the process with the choir members, it's what it was trying to attempt to do is to shift this understanding of the data side of AI being sort of public only in the sense of access to actually being public in the sense of having greater involvement of the people who are contributing towards data sets in the strategic development of these data sets, and also potential value distribution associated with their use within the wider AI pipeline. And so on this note, I'm going to hand over to Jen to speak about the data governance experiment, and then we'll come to the most boring part, which is the final legal infrastructure that we came up with. But yeah, so you have much to look forward to.
It's actually really exciting. Well, I can't think of any better way to start the collective data governance section by just giving a shout out to our community of data contributors, the 15 UK choirs, Blackburn People's Choir, Carnoustie Choir, Cunningham Choir, the Fitzharding Consort, the Fourth Choir, Hive Choir, Leeds Vocal Movement, London Contemporary Voices, Musark, New London Chamber Choir, Open Arts Community Choir, Ordzal A Cappella Singers, the Ravenswood Singers, South Lakes A Cappella, and Spectrum Singers. So these are the 15 choirs that, as John from Hive Choir likes to say, answered the call and joined in to record performances that ended up being our choral AI dataset. So In thinking about what we wanted to achieve when engaging these choirs, we had a few goals. So I think one thing that probably was clear in Matt's part of his presentation is in this generative AI landscape, actually, we are all stakeholders. All of our data is being used for training. But that being said, oftentimes we don't know this is happening. And so as a result, we don't really think of ourselves as a group, even if technically all of our data is grouped together as the raw material to train models. There isn't really a sense of this collective identity of us all as a data group. So one of our first goals was to explore what building up that collective identity might look like for these choirs who have their own identity, but how will they see themselves as all parts of this common data set? After building that identity, what else can we do? What kind of collective action is possible on the road to collective governance? So in approaching that, as Victoria mentioned, we started this experiment thinking perhaps a data trust and a data trustee might be a good fit. There's also data cooperatives out there. There's so many interesting possible arrangements of governance in the world, but something really important to us, and that was a big part of Sylvie Delacroix, one of our advisors' research, is to enable bottoms-up development of any form of governance. So we didn't want to come in and say, it's going to be a data trust, you're going to give all your rights to me, this person you've never met. In fact, what made most sense was to engage with the choirs and let the right governance forms and tools emerge from that process. And crucially, have legal backing, which is one of the most exciting and important things that Victoria will talk about shortly. And the final goal, that is my personal favorite, I think Victoria also coined this phrase, is a question we asked ourselves is, oftentimes AI development happens within the context of private ecosystems, big tech labs, and so it's subject to certain pressures that are unique to AI being developed in these environments. But given that this AI is being developed by a group of artists in collaboration with choirs, by a GLAM institution, the Serpentine, what might it look like to live action roleplay, so LARP, what good faith AI development could look like? So that was a really exciting challenge to explore together. So I would like to just briefly share two quotes from our choirs themselves. I think one of the most challenging things in this experiment was to even start to think of something like choral voice as data. Even though, as Matt and Eva have shared, all media, everything on the internet is really data now. There is this disconnect between singing together in a choir setting, oftentimes only in a live performance. To think of that activity and that music then being recorded and stored in a digital form and then becoming data and raw material for something like AI. The ways they described this process of thinking of choral voice as data was surreal, interesting but scary, unmusical, and soulless, which, fair enough. But I think one thing that many of the choirs did see as an opportunity was, to the second quote, well, this is going to happen whether we like it or not. It's already happening. So can we take this opportunity to shape the discussion through our project and set some parameters for how AI should be used in the music industry? So what the engagement looked like, it was a really action-packed few months. Started with some conversations with the choirs. We had some open choral data conversations on Zoom where we released a data preference survey. One outcome of that survey was actually people did want to get more involved in the decision making, or at least have the opportunity. So from that, we created a data governance working group, and finally released a polis to gather some preferences about license terms. And there's a few other things that are in motion that Victoria will share more about. But the real outcome of all this engagement, all these Zoom conversations, chats on a Google Doc, emails back and forth, answers to a survey, what it really allowed us to do is think about, as this art production was being produced, as the technical work was happening, what are the targeted interventions we can take across the model pipeline that actually respond to the preferences and interests of the choir members? This included things like transparency or more information about certain things, like who has access to the data and how long. Interestingly, also, the choir was really interested in knowing where the data was stored. Is it on EU servers, UK servers, US servers? Defining unacceptable behavior, also very important, and also defining choir recognition and attribution by future users was important. And one I will just briefly zoom into before handing back over to Victoria is there was an interest in having more of a say in the selection of the license and the license terms. So in order to surface what the group preferences towards that might be, we released Apollos. For those who aren't familiar with the platform, it's there on the left. It's a preference gathering and grouping platform. So essentially you enter seed statements, so things like folks in the project should be kept up to date on usage of their data, and then you can submit anonymous votes where you agree, disagree, or select pass or unsure. People can also submit their own statements. Actually, this one was submitted by an anonymous choir member. And through all the voting, what Polis is really great at is things like identifying the statements that were the most divisive or had the most consensus. And helpfully for our case, 2 preference groups emerged. So we imagined that there would be a plurality of different preferences, but in our case, there were 2 main groups. One group that was quite open to sharing, share all the data. Let all the researchers, educators, other users find interesting use cases. And we had another group that was a bit more concerned about what open sharing might mean. And they were very clear that they did not want the data set or the model to be used for further commercial use cases by other people that weren't within the core project team. So essentially what we can do with this now is if the model or one of the models is released, we have a sense for the right license for it. And that has all been informed by the choir members themselves. So now I will hand it over to Victoria again.
So as mentioned briefly in my introduction, it was important for us to not just conduct this experiment in a kind of speculative manner where we do a napkin design of the most kind of perfect organizational structure for managing the rights that the choir members have in relationship to this data set, in relationship to future uses of the data set. So I think what's also important to mention, and it was alluded to in Matt's talk, is that once this data set has been created, yes, it's been used for this project, but it could potentially be used in other processes of AI development. It could be used for research. It could be used for commercial purposes, non-commercial purposes. And so the process that we went through with the choirs that Jen has just described, what it allowed us to do is to understand what are the preferences of the choir members in terms of the types of future users that they find acceptable and the kinds of uses that they feel comfortable about. So perhaps the Creative Commons license, and this is where we go into the weeds of it, is not the best type of license in relationship to AI models, but it does give us a set of kind of modular parameters according to which we can reflect the wishes of the choirs in terms of setting the terms on which these future models will be circulating in the world. So this entire process had this shadow side of working very closely with 2 great lawyers. One lawyer, Alex Lawrence Archer from AWO Agency. It's a specialist data rights agency. They did really great work, not just sort of advising clients, but also pushing for more kind of empowered use of GDPR, which is the main legislation in this country for data rights. And with an IP lawyer, Alistair Milner, that's our creative, that's a different Alistair. Alistair, oh my God, I forgot his surname, Alistair, who helped us draft the performance license agreement that effectively standardized all the preferences that the choir members have communicated to us in a legal form. And upon signing this licensing agreement, the choir members are giving us the right to use these rights in the context of further sub-licensing of this data set. Now, there are a lot of kind of thorny questions, both in relationship, and I'm not going to go into details here. Actually, Jen and I are writing a white paper right now, so if people are interested, please sign up to the Future Art Ecosystems newsletter, and you will get your own personal version of. No, kidding. You'll get the white paper. But there are a lot of thorny questions around, like, how applicable are IP rights when it comes to training data as an input, and obviously also, is our outputs of AI models subject to IP. But what was important for us in this experiment was to use the existing legal mechanisms and to really push the envelope on them. And so how did we do that? So what we tried to achieve, it was a collectivization of the rights that were in the mix. So one of the biggest problems right now in, I guess, the AI ecosystem is the imbalance of power, the asymmetry between any individual user and individual contributor of data and AI developers. So there are a lot of great papers out there written on the need to develop a new type of organizational form that kind of scales the individual agencies of individual rights holders by collectivizing the various rights that they can rely on, that they can leverage, and to use these collectivized rights as leverage in trying to negotiate the terms on which the data sets to which they're contributing are going to be used in the AI pipeline. And as Jen has mentioned, there have been various theoretical positions coming primarily from the research context on use of data trusts, and trust is a specific vehicle in the UK law, on the use of cooperatives as a structure, on the use of contracts as another structure. So in our case, we did quite a bit of research into the possibility of using a trust structure, and as much as I would love to give you all the insights on that, we perhaps can reserve that for the discussion, but it turns out that it was not the right type of structure for this project, and actually there may be issues with the structure more generally. But on the bright side, we did find a structure that was suitable for our purposes, and that was the trading entity, or Serpentines Limited Liability Company, which already kind of performs the mission of helping Serpentine engage in certain activities outside of its sort of main institutional activities, and we're actually attaching the responsibility for Serpentine to steward the dataset to this entity would make a lot of sense. And in fact, in the feedback that we have received from the choir members, they felt comfortable and they felt they could trust Serpentine or Serpentine's entity to take on the stewardship role and to become kind of the home of this data set and the enforcement vehicle, I guess, for the various terms that have been enshrined in the licensing agreement. So, for the legal innovation geeks here, I guess what's really unique about this I guess, constellation that we have constructed is that we have not just collectivized all the rights and given those rights to a trusted intermediary that can now then, kind of enforce these rights in dealing with the data set in the AI ecosystem, but that we have combined data rights and IP rights in kind of the same constitutional document, which will be guiding the actions of the trusted intermediary. And the reason this is interesting is because, when we're thinking about scaling up, it's one thing to sort of have that as a proposition, but then it's like, well, what does this mean when it actually needs to function in practice. Like, what should these new trusted intermediary actors be doing? How to keep them accountable to their actions? And so the idea of having this kind of constitutional document that allows Serpentine as a trusted intermediary to do the things that are listed out here is an interesting experiment, and it's live. We're going to see how it unfolds in the years to come, and I think on this note, I will end it, and hopefully we can expand back into more exciting terrains. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to move to the front, and it's also that, and have outsider perspective.
Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. So yeah, it's a real kind of privilege to be sat amongst these brilliant people. So my name's Aidan Pepin. I'm, I guess, a kind of technology policy researcher. I currently work in the non-profit research lab arm of a Canadian AI model company. But most of my career before that, I worked in and around non-profits doing work on kind of the impact between emerging novel technologies and kind of society culture. So I have a kind of social research background looking at things like data governance and so on. Okay.
Can we have Matt?
We're all good. Trying to work out if no, okay. So I've done some social research looking at the kind of data governance structures that Jen's been talking about. But my background goes way back. I actually started in the arts, so this is a real combination of things that I love here, and it's really exciting to be part of. I wanted to zoom out a little bit before we kind of dive into the discussion to just talk a little bit about exactly how data is used in the process of training AI models and the different steps that are involved. So there's kind of a few different stages. I'm going to crudely and crassly whiz through them. And the first one is kind of pre-training. This is where you take your kind of random array of neural nets and you try to get them to learn a skill or a task, whether it's classifying images, generating text, whatever it might be. And to do this kind of initial pre-training generally requires unfathomably huge amounts of data, and this is where you kind of, you just scrape the web, you get everything you can get that's publicly available, and you try to make a model do something and perform some kind of ability. But the kind of inflection point where those models go to start being useful is in the downstream fine-tuning. So you take your model that has an ability to generate text or generate images or whatever, and then you give that model much more specific data sets. And that allows the model to develop a really interesting or highly capable ability, whether it's an ability to kind of make sense of legal text or an ability to produce incredible human voices. But this kind of fine-tuning stage, you tend to get the data sets are still huge, but you tend to get much more specific with them. And I think this is where we get a really interesting potential for some of these kind of novel governance structures, because when you're trying to do something really specific with an AI model, train it to give medical information, train it to generate particular types of artistic output, whatever it might be, the spectrum is huge. That downstream fine-tuning is much closer to particular communities, particular types of expertise, particular groups of people who may have much more of a stake in what you're doing with that data and the impact that that data is going to have on the model. So I think this kind of specific fine-tuning stage of the data training process is kind of full of opportunity for some of these novel and really exciting approaches to data governance and data stewardship, whether it's in kind of artistic and creative contexts as we've seen this evening, but right across the spectrum. And I might just kind of briefly touch on, I'm not here to kind of plug my colleagues' work, but briefly touch on one piece of work we've done around multilingual, which took a similar approach. So most language models today are really, really good at English, and particularly North American English. They're often quite bad at any languages beyond that, and we've been doing some work to try and make a dent in that problem. And one of the ways we went about it was build a huge data set fine-tuning data set, so this kind of downstream later in the stage data set, which covered 101 languages. And the way we built that was by working with more than 3,000 people across 120 countries who volunteered their time to help us build this fine-tuning data set across all of those languages and then train models on it. And I mention it because I think it's kind of another interesting example of how different approaches to governing data can kind of help us do more interesting things with AI models, build them in ways that commercial incentives won't always build them for. Some of the languages that we looked at have, tens of thousands of speakers and their dialects within them. There's unfortunately not huge commercial incentive to address those languages. So these novel approaches to gathering data with communities can help plug some of the gaps that the market is going to miss otherwise. And maybe I'll just kind of close my, I guess, opening reflections with some kind of general thoughts on the importance of non-technical perspectives in this space. So I don't have a technical background. I come from, as I say, a social science and humanities background. I think I actually really resonated with some of the quotes from the chorister, soulless, scary, what does this mean? As someone that works in this space, I have similar questions around what these technologies in all their forms kind of mean for the societies in which we live. And those questions are not technical. I work with some brilliant coders. I often have to give them real schooling on how government works, what democracy is, and I don't kind of say that to make them sound like fools. It's just they don't spend their time in those spaces. They spend their time doing very technical work, and that takes all of their time in brain space. Some of the challenges that we have to solve around how these technologies are going to impact and shape our world require creative thinking, they require humanities thinking, they require the input of people who not only kind of take a tool that's being built by technologists and use it, but break it, adapt it, use it in ways it was maybe never intended for, and that helps us understand what we actually want these tools to do for us, and make meaning and significance out of these new technologies and these new roles that large data sets will play in the societies in which we live. So I hope that wasn't too kind of rambling and all over the place,
No,
but
that was great.
this is a wonderful conversation to be a part of.
Yeah, we're going to have a short conversation and then open also to your questions. But I want to open with asking Matt actually and link what Aidan just said about language training. And a lot of times when we talk about AI models, we have talked a lot about individual data rights. And a lot of times it seems to me that we forget that a lot of culture is actually based on an idea of collectiveness. And you just mentioned language, and there it is, people just come together to make sure that models speak their language. It's something that if we go forward into this world with AI, if we want it or not, as it seems to be the case, then people say, okay, I want the models to speak my language, and we invest in that. So Matt, I was wondering, how much was it part of your thinking to move the AI ecosystem away from all these discussions? I mean, the discussions about individual rights are important, but to add to that, the collective aspect.
Pretty significant, I'd say, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first off, just to reiterate, and this has kind of been said by a few people, that looking at the volume of data needed to fine-tune these models to get something interesting, there is this kind of interesting opportunity there where you say, okay, well, these models require a lot of data. Actually, necessarily that data is gathered from a lot of people. And so this is actually kind of the inherent collectiveness of this training is actually an opportunity to reconsider rights, right? That in actuality, with the exception of very, very few celebrities, for example, like the classic debate about Scarlett Johansson's voice with OpenAI or whatnot, right? Actually, when we're our individual data isn't actually worth that much in these contexts. But collectively, it could be. And so, but similarly, I mean, there are kind of parallel discussions here, right? There's the one discussion which we've obviously done a lot of work around, which is how to make these kind of models fit in a very awkward way with traditional creative industries and how they've worked in the 20th century. And a lot of that falls down to individual IP rights and so on and so forth, which is, it's complicated and a very awkward fit. I mean, even the nature, like the kind of the logic of copyright is kind of stretched very much by the kind of the idiosyncratic nature of training. But the more interesting question, in a sense, and this is why we're drawn to maybe more folk forms. You know, there's clearly some kind of an analogy to be made between folk choral group singing and language, as you just pointed out, right? These are things these are habits and traditions that existed long before we had IP industries, and will likely exist long after. And also the motivation to kind of contribute to group singing exercises is bigger than the media that's produced, right? Which is also kind of a very beautiful way of looking at this. And so there's this other thread to the show, which we don't talk about so much, but I think is an interesting thread in this context, is trying to at least reanimate some sense of spirit of the public domain, which regrettably, you know, is an older conversation that, you know, people were very jazzed about in the time of, you know, Flickr and blogs, but in the platform era has just kind of receded, of saying, well, no, actually there's something quite beautiful to this idea of trying to reanimate that spirit and look at the potential for open data and open source interventions, at least in the model space, to kind of get people animated about this idea of contributing to something greater than themselves for the benefit of everybody. And I think that spirit in and of itself, even though there's lots of particularities and bureaucratic complications to it, that spirit itself, I think, can be instructive even beyond this experiment of saying, well, no, like, what configurations ultimately, when you start thinking on a governmental level or whatever, need to be established for large groups of people to contribute data willingly and then receive bounties in turn that are not intermediated by the market. That is a big open question that everyone has to grapple with. And so, of course, we're only making a very small dent here, a very small gesture here, but that feels like the bigger question, and the closest I can get to is really kind of reanimating the spirit of the public domain and culture in and of itself being something that we all participate in freely. It's not really owned by anybody. There's something beautiful to that.
Yeah, thank you. To continue from there, the collective in action, and I want to speak to Jen about this, is another level. I mean, we are all, or I hope most of us in the room, sort of are like the idea of unions and of collective power, and the idea, and I think the exhibition and the work of Matt and Holly is a really important contribution to sort of start more about this debate. But in reality, it seems, because we live in so neoliberal times, that we have sort of partly not the right legal mechanisms. That's also because AI is a totally new technology where old legal mechanisms might not fit. But we also have the collective work to do, like come together. And a training data set, of course, is a bit odd because other than classic collectives who all sit in a room, who all come to one organization, who all have one idea, you have these 15 different choirs with all different ideas. So I would like to ask you to talk a bit about how was this, how much work was it really, and why is this idea, because you work about participatory elements in technology much longer than this project, why do you think this is really important?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting because in many other participatory data activities, you tend to engage with individuals or a representative sample of a population. But I think something quite nice about this project is we were engaging with existing communities. So they had their own culture, they had their own decision-making processes. They were all really different. Some were more like dictatorships, other maybe more pure democracy where everyone comes together for an assembly and the floor is open. Others were more open to representation, and I think that messiness is just very human, and it's very exciting, in my opinion, because it's the reality of how our human systems are. So I think it was actually very fun to see these differences and get to think about how do we preserve this plurality that is going to exist in any group of humans, and see how we can try to translate this plurality into some of our AI processes. I think it's not a really easy or simple technical problem when you frame it this way, but in many ways, I think it makes it a much more exciting challenge.
Victoria, do you want to come in on this and talk about the legal perspective and how that works for collective or does not work at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we're using a lot of words, I don't know if everybody can hear me, like in a very broad brushstroke way, right? So I think we're saying collective governance. You know, there are a lot of questions to what is actually collective governance, right? So ultimately, this was just an experiment to try to surface preferences from a group and in a good faith way, average them out to create a standardized arrangement that could then be enforced, you know, in the future. And, you know, this might seem insufficient in some ways, but as you were just alluding to, you know, this is already quite a lot compared to what is done in a standard context, like of the industry context. And so it does kind of present this challenge of like, you know, if this is quite a lot in the context where the group, the data set was quite small, where all the actors were good faith, you know, I guess there are just questions as to whether this is an exportable model, or we need to maybe on the other hand change the way that we think about AI more generally. Like, do we actually really want to have very, very big models? Is this like the right direction? Or do we actually want to sort of have more like smaller models, but that are much more closer to specific communities? You know, are we more invested in an idea, let's say, of sovereign AI, where actually there is like a greater attachment to existing institutions, which, you know, there is definitely a lack of faith in existing institutions in the democratic world, and not just, but still. So I think what this project, this very cutesy project, you know, around collective governance shows is that we're not going to be able to do collective governance at scale. But there are models to, like, there is a possibility to rethink the vision for AI, and actually I think rethinking scale is what I would say this tiny experiment has shown, but also what this disjuncture between the legal mechanisms and the extent of the challenges and the problems that AI poses to democracy, like that tension, you know, also points in the direction of rethinking vision for AI more generally.
Yeah, I mean, the smaller models point I think is really important, and I don't think it's talked about enough that we tend to think about AI as these like monolithic, all singing, all dancing. The goal is to get to something which can do everything better than any human ever. And it will be exactly. It will be everywhere and it will solve everything and blah, 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 blah. And depending on where you sit on the spectrum, you either think that's exciting and it will fix all of our social problems, or it's terrifying and it will destroy everything. I think it's a really mischaracterization of what we actually have, which is essentially a whole ecosystem now of probabilistic models, which when you give it an output based on a series of probabilities can give you an output. That's what they are. And they can be big and do lots of things, or they can be really small and optimized. And I think in the same way that we see across kind of all different like technological and infrastructural parts of society, specialization is something that often wins out in the end. Like if you I don't know, think of a context. You probably want something that's specialized for that context rather than something that's general. And there's a lot of potential that we have to have communities, have groups of expertise, whether these are local communities and local groups of expertise or professions or whatever it might be, thinking about what do they need models for, how to build those models, how might those models be tailored towards their particular needs and their particular use cases. And in that setting, I think you have a lot of potential not only for models which better serve, AI models which better serve society's needs, but opportunities for interesting approaches towards more collective governance of not only the data sets that those models are trained on and then use in their day-to-day running, but of the models themselves. So the other aspect there as well is if you've got a smaller, more optimized, locally specific model, you don't need a supercomputer to run it. You can run it on localized hardware, which more people around the world have access to. So there's I think that the smaller models point, I think, is a really important one. And I think whenever we think about AI, thinking about lots of different models that can do different things at different scales rather than these monolithic all singing, all dancing is a much more useful way to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take the technology sort of point and take it to art and ask Eva. So I think one point of, so how do you see, I mean, this is an exhibition, it's in an art context. It is about AI. I was quite impressed. It seems to sort of, the whole exhibition making seems to kind of shadow the idea of, many different people working together on one project. I remember when Eva gave the speech to open the exhibition, you had a very long liner notes with lots and lots of people who worked there. So it seemed to be a whole collective that comes together. And it seems something we forget often when we talk about contemporary AI. We look to the last Google papers. We look at the big names. We are very happy we have two male, Sam Altman and Elon Musk, in the room, which give orientation, while the fact is actually that the teams that develop the technology are huge. They're quite, and it's quite, I mean, AI papers, those of you who read them know that, there are a lot of authors signing them. So it's a certain culture that doesn't seem to translate. How did you see the role of art or the space of art as something where you could address this technology a bit differently?
I think what I've always been drawn to in Matt and Holly's practice is their insistence that every step of the process, is there a weird thing happening?
Yeah, it's all good.
It's fine. Every step of the process is in the AI model pipeline / art pipeline is a creative activity, and it's part of the thesis that actually Mercedes and I put together when we started the Creative AI Lab in 2019, that the site of artistic production was changing, moving from the kind of final image that was created or final song or whatever that was created through these models to actually be the collection of data, the cleaning, the labeling of data, the building of the models, and that was actually where we needed to be looking as curators, as cultural producers for the new kind of artist, and they might look very different than the artist who, the single genius artist painting in their studio. And so I think with the show, what we tried to do is to consider the collection of the collection of training data as a series of 15 performances. Every time we went to visit these choirs and set up the recording protocol, that was a kind of performance, and maybe the medium of performance is changing in that way. It was a performance for the model. Ultimately, it was a performance between a group of people getting to know each other, and I mean us as Serpentine team and the artists and the choirs, obviously the members knew each other, building trust, and that was a kind of performative activity as well. So yeah, seeing these like new genres emerge, I guess, and making sure that each group that was involved was called out during the exhibition and in the credit wall text. That's something that's very important to our team to show the scale of these kinds of projects.
Thank you. I'd like to open up to questions, and I know the first question is always a bit difficult, but there's one.
Should I pass the mic?
Yeah, pass one mic.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dylan. I'm an SCS student at UCL. My question for the panel is, how did you avoid falling victim to the tyranny of the majority when it came to deciding how the data and future modeling would be used and circulated?
Yeah, maybe I can get us started. I guess one thing that made a difference in our case is none of the choirs actually knew each other. So in that sense, they were quite powerful in their own respects because they were interacting on their own and then coming to the event. So there wasn't really this case where there was a really loud voice or a really strong opinion and that swayed the whole crowd. I feel like each choir really had a lot of power individually and how they were represented. We also did a lot of anonymous polling too. So if people did not want to come to a meeting or did not have time to come to a meeting, we made sure there was ways for them to input that didn't require us just listening to the loudest voice, for example. But I think the selection of tools also makes a difference. So we ended up using Polis, right? And I think it is a great way to make sure that different groups are recognized. In our case, we only had 2, but there could be more. And in that way, you have all the different preference groups actually represented and you're looking at them side by side, as opposed to just letting that one comment that someone said or a pie chart that shows the most popular opinion be the deciding factor. So I think a combination of how you set up the engagement, the selection of tools, and how you make sure people have many ways to engage. That's what I would say.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, and congratulations on this work. It's really, it's very exciting, it's inspiring, and I'm looking forward to seeing the work in the gallery on the weekend, hopefully. So I have a question that's maybe responding to some of the things that different people on the panel spoke about. And this is really about the sort of communitarian or the social life of being part of a collective. So when I was watching, when I was listening, the first thing that sort of struck me was this is happening in, I mean, just the fact that it's called The Call. The first image that we saw is in a church. And I mean, the first associations for me were indeed spiritual. And I love the idea that, you know, voice is so central to spirituality and sort of like the collective experience of faith and spirituality. And so it immediately made me think about the context that I'm coming from and thinking about like Buddhist chanting and thinking about the fact that like in Islam, the Quran is passed through voice and through collectively chanting together. And I think my question, it's not really a question, but I'm sort of throwing this out as what we might call a prompt these days, what was that experience of, that subjective experience of being part of this group, of how does singing change when you know that you're training, but it's also something that is a spiritual experience for you. And I'm already sort of thinking about what does it mean to take this model to places where people have a strong sense of group or collective identity associated with that voice. How does it change when you know you're part of this and you're not protected by data infrastructures? Here, there's an antiquated data mechanism that doesn't work, and so as humans, we're creatively reorganizing ourselves around it. Sorry, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. This was very long. I'm an academic, I do this sometimes. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciated your TED Talk, actually. I was nodding. I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, I think what you were saying at the end of kind of coming together to organize ourselves, actually, that's kind of how we've attempted to situate AI in our practice a little bit, is rather than seeing it as kind of like a shiny new thing, basically just situating it as a new coordination technology in a long lineage of coordination technologies that, you know, when you expand the parameters out that far, you could talk about religion in that context just as you could talk about group singing or proto-linguistics, of just basically saying, you know, these are new methods in which people come together to produce something greater than themselves, and also they serve as some kind of a mirror, like some kind of a mechanism for definition. For definition of a group, but also some kind of a mirror to assume an identity or some kind of a sense of self. And so I think that, you know, that you can't really escape some of the spiritual or religious connotations here. But just as with group singing, we dealt with this quite a fair amount with with Proto, actually. There's a great academic called Joseph Jordania, whose work is quite controversial, who talks a lot about kind of the evolutionary history of group singing and the kind of the strange phenomenon that many different groups, from Indonesia and Taiwan to the Bulgarian Mountains, all kind of developed the same habits. They sing very similarly, which lends some credibility to this idea. In the same way that you could say that there are just there's clear continuity between disparate religious traditions that were developed in complete isolation from each other. So we try to situate AI and this data thing within that lineage of saying, well, okay, well, this is a new opportunity to reflect on ourselves and to maybe come up with new rituals, or just a new, for want of a better term, kind of consciousness about what it is exactly that we're doing. Of course, with the provocation there being that there's going to be good ways to do this and bad ways to do this, right? So I'm also rambling for my TED talk, but I enjoyed your ramble because it correlates with many of the things we think about. Yeah.
And then there.
Okay. Hi, my name is Amelia. I am a master's student studying sound and music computing, and I found this very informative. I just have a question specifically for Matt, but if anyone else wants to contribute, that works as well. I'm a huge fan of Holly's work, and I'm just a little bit concerned, specifically from my experience, how can we ensure the authenticity of artists? There's a quote by Caroline Polachek, who is an amazing vocalist, who there seems to be a sense of inevitability of the music industry being able to acquire specifically vocal data, and I hear a lot of the inevitable commentary that all media is trading data, especially art, especially music. So I guess my question is, as someone who potentially wants to pursue the interdisciplinary field of music and AI, how do we make the sentiment in a more positive breath on a larger scale? Like, how specifically, if we're a software engineer at X tech company, what can we do as an individual to truly make an impact and actually speak for people who seem to be losing their voice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also appreciate that the statement "all media is training data" is slightly provocative. I find it's somewhat of a revealing statement, because the spirit we're trying to bring to it is just saying, look, this is just what is. And actually, it need not necessarily be a negative thing, but it is telling that a lot of people, including friends and collaborators of ours, when they're confronted with that statement, it carries a valence of inevitability or something, or doom or something like this. I think that that from our perspective, I can't speak for Holly specifically, but probably can speak for her more than anybody else. Our feeling here is that it's really important to not confuse media for art. And so oftentimes when we think about these questions, there is also a sense of resignation to this idea of saying, well, if anyone can now take your data, steal your voice, and produce infinite media with these kind of magic machines of you, you're not needed anymore. And I actually think that is a statement that is often echoed, strangely enough, on both sides of the culture war of this, right? It's on the side of the, people kind of pumping text docs. They say, oh, well, this is a new era for art. We won't need the artists in the same way anymore because you could listen to Infinite Drake on Spotify or whatever. And then on the other side of it, the kind of like the doomers would be like, well, they're stealing our data, so, now no one will need my painting anymore. And I actually think that we fall somewhere in the middle of that, or kind of dismiss both of those arguments to say that actually when you look at domains, for example, like choir, one of the kind of perverse ironies of the idea of producing a choral model is that nobody wants to go and listen in a room to a choral model. The media that a choir produces is just one aspect of a much richer participatory experience that we would consider something culturally important. You could say the same for DJing, right? The classic, the kind of classic artistic medium that is very, very automatable and has been long before generative AI. People go to participate in these group dancing experiences for very, very different reasons that are distinct from the ability to automate the production of media. And so that would be the optimistic take, I think, that we would probably advocate for, is to say, well, yeah, on the one hand, we do have to understand that when we produce something that is documented now, it is training data. This is a new dimension to what we do. And as a result, it probably makes a lot of sense for us to embrace that and to think about new things that we can do with that, and also maybe new protections that need to be in place in the case of exploitation, which is necessary. But also that there's much more to this. That actually, you bring up Caroline Polachek. Caroline's going to be just fine because people want to go into a room and listen to like the most remarkable voice in pop music, and so you could automate Caroline or Caroline's vocalizations, but I don't think that that's going to be ultimately kind of competing with her outside of very specific domains in which there are some protections in place. And so our take is kind of. It is intentionally provocative, largely because I think from our side of things, we've spent the best part of a decade actually speaking to people, let's say in industry or in media, to tell them, hey, look, like we need to take this seriously. This is not a game. These tools, I personally am of the belief that the AI substrate will be as significant as the internet has been, albeit different. We need to take this seriously, but that does not necessarily mean that we subscribe to a defeatist, fatalist perspective on this. I actually, for me, that's almost a disqualifier. When I hear that, I'm like, oh, actually, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, for example, you were talking about the supermodels versus small specific models. When I hear the assumption that all media or all generative production is going to be produced by one master model in the server in California, that is an immediate disqualifier for me, where I'm like, I don't actually think that you've looked into this enough. So there is actually a lot more room for us to express ourselves in this context than the media would have you believe. That being said, we do have to take it seriously. So it's important to not shy away from a statement such as all media is training data. I hope that's helpful, and I appreciate your question.
Great. We take the last two questions. Sorry, they're already taken. One's here and one's there in the front, and then we go and have some drinks.
Hi, I'm Sylvan. Thinking about the visionary iconic status of those like individual men that you talked about, like having the Elon Musk, the Sam Altman, it feels like one of the reasons why people can invest in them. They think that there is this one static vision of AI, and they want to believe in a future that is consistent. And something that I've experienced from going to the exhibition and engaging with the work more broadly is through this collectivity, there seems to be a negotiation about what can change, about like how through this negotiation the vision of AI can change. And so I wonder, because you're not having to represent any stocks, I don't think, I'd be fascinated to hear from the people who participated in this, like how your vision of AI changed because of going through this process and treating these choirs as part of this training. Like if there was anything you went into it and you feel different coming out the other end.
Maybe we ask Eva, because you worked before in your own practice with AI and you were very closely part of the exhibition, but also the training process and everything. Oh, you have?
Oh, I have. I think the point that you brought up, that people need to instigate what they want to use these models for. I think the practices of artists that I think are the strongest are artists who have a background in the thing that they're interested in automating in some way, and they have a kind of specialist ability to uncover what's interesting about what the model is producing. When Matt and Holly were generating these kind of 3-minute outputs, I think, Matt, we were talking about them as uncut gems, and really having an ability to not just, you can produce a media ad infinitum, but how do you know how to sift through that, and what kind of wormholes to go down? How do you know that something is worth pursuing in this mass of media? So I think what I see as like a very interesting challenge, and maybe the next space for cultural producers or communities, et cetera, is to help people figure out what they want to use these models for, and what are the like pre-existing prerequisites that they already bring to the table in order to engage with them. I think this was really hard with the choirs. They really didn't understand their data, their singing as data, and it almost had to be described to them as like a new kind of asset class. The recordings that were produced, they didn't even want anyone to hear them because, you know, mistakes were made. They weren't created in order for people to listen to them as recordings. They were really made as training data. And I think, thinking about, what are you going to use these models for in the future, and how is this new like asset class of training data going to be used and protected? I think it's super interesting and will lead to new kinds of art and also new kinds of community programming and things like that.
Excellent.
Is that all right?
Yeah, no, wait for the mic maybe. So just to make sure Matt can hear you too.
It's on. Okay. Hi, I'm Lei. I'm a choir singer who works in the social campaign sector. And I have a question about the legal implications of introducing data rights into this conversation about creative workers and AI. Because when I think about this topic, I remember the Hollywood strikes by writers and actors. And in that strike, the primary discourse was around IP rights and labor rights. I heard very little about data rights and what that implies for the people who were participating in the movement back then. So just wondering, maybe more in the UK context, what does it mean to engage data rights in this conversation, and what are the legal and policy implications that you think might be important to share?
Sure. So data rights in the UK are governed by GDPR, as I just described. And what GDPR protects are personal data rights. So it's about individuals being directly identifiable when data is being processed in some shape or form. So in the context of this project, and I didn't go into the detail because it's pretty it's pretty intense. But in the context of this project, there were various points where data was being processed, and the most, I guess, significant part for AI training is when data is being prepared for training and when the training is taking place. Now, in that context, only the soloists' voices were personally identifiable. So actually, in the context of this project, it is only the soloists who could make use of GDPR. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to stay this way. So, for example, there could be a different setup, a recording setup, where actually more voices could be identifiable. We can also imagine that technology will evolve, and actually there could be, through technology, individual voices could be identified and traced back to specific individuals. But, it's a bit of a blunt tool when it comes to when it comes to actually having agency as an individual singer in relationship to AI training. So, there's a common misperception around data rights that individuals need to consent in order for AI companies, for AI training to take place. Most AI companies, the kind of the legal foundation, the legal reason for why they're able to use personal data in training is what's called legitimate interest. And so as long as a privacy notice is kind of served to whoever's personal data is being used, the company can declare a legitimate interest and they're able to train models. What GDPR does, and I don't know if people use Instagram, but in the previous months, you may have received a notification, right, that you have the right to effectively kind of opt out. You can say that it is actually against your interests for Meta to train on your personal data. And this is interesting because this kind of the right to object is, at an individual level, doesn't really mean anything. Once you collectivize the rights and you delegate or mandate, this is what we did in our case, to mandate those rights to an intermediary that is overseeing how the data set is being used, the intermediary can then act on your behalf to object to uses that you as a collective have decided, would be against your interest. So, this is by far, it's not a perfect set of protections, but we are quite lucky, I think, in the EU and the UK context to have GDPR, because at the very least, it provides this sort of foundation upon which we can, create further policy recommendations as to these questions around collectivization of rights, and should there be specific provisions made to certain sectors of society who would benefit from greater protection beyond just personal rights. So it is a live conversation, and yeah, so I think that's where I'll end. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything on.
Okay, then with this, I slowly wind us down. I would like to thank the speakers and Matt for staying on screen for 90 minutes. Also, you all for coming. I'd like to thank in particular Jennifer Wong and Catherine from the Science Gallery for hosting us here. It's a super nice space, I love it. And Andrew from the Technic, who helped us overcome very old pre-AI tech problems, which were Apple versus PC and why does my cable not give the sound I want to. The future and the glorious future is in small models. Everyone take this home, and I hope you enjoy this with a glass of wine outside. I will be around. You can speak to us a bit longer. Thank you for coming.